Welcome back. I have the great honor of introducing our last panel of the day. And thank you all for hanging with us, but I think you will find this discussion to be especially interesting and poignant now. We have two excellent speakers for the panel on What Would Ed Think? Current Policy Perspectives. First, we have Kim Klausing, who is now the Deputy Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Analysis in the Office of Tax Policy at the U.S. Treasury. What a mouthful. Previously, Kim held the Zoll Chair in Tax Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law. And prior to that, she was the Miller and Mintz Professor of Economics at Reed College for many years. And her economic policy research, which most of you are familiar with, focuses on the interplay between government taxing decisions and multinational corporate behavior, where she's worked with the IMF and just any number of prestigious domestic policy forums. Kim is the author of many articles and the excellent 2019 book, Open: The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. And then also with us is Chye-Ching Huang, who is the Executive Director of the Tax Law Institute at NYU Law. Before starting the Tax Law Center, she was the Senior Director of Economic Policy for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She did just amazing work. And previously, she was a tax professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where she published a lot of research on tax law, policy, and regulation. She has authored many articles and pieces on policy and speaks frequently in the media and on occasion before Congress on tax policy issues. And so I will turn the presentation over to Kim and to Chye.
Thanks. I'm assuming I'll go first.
And Kim, extra thank you for joining us today on what has to be, anyway.
Yeah, it was
yet another blizzard of crises. So thank you very much.
But thank you. So it's really great to see all these friends, and I can't tell you how nice it is to be here, even virtually, to celebrate the life and work of Ed Kleinbard. The first thing I'll just say is that he is so missed in this moment. In particular, he would have thrived and he would have had so much to say to add to the public discourse. He's absolutely irreplaceable. Ed was insuppressible. He was full of insight. He was a true scholar, a voracious reader, immersed in the literature, a deep thinker, but at the same time, he was also a realist and a person who was very much engaged with the world as it is. Indeed, it's really hard to imagine that his indomitable spirit is extinguished. So I am quite grateful to Suzanne and Dan and Roseanne and Joe and Ed's colleagues, especially Greg and Ed M and Mira, for putting this tribute together. It's been a really amazing day. So my task on this panel is to channel Ed's spirit. And let me just say at the outset, for anyone who's watching the recording, that these are not the views of the US Treasury. These are not even necessarily my views, but they are my well-informed sense of Ed's view. And in addition to drawing on the very many emails that I've received from Ed, and like many of you, I have a folder dedicated to him and the conversations that we've had, I will also draw on his work in order to channel his spirit and look at today's policy moment. I'm going to focus on international tax, but I'm also going to talk about the larger fiscal context and the dual bite. And much of this work has been discussed today, but my task is to relate it to the policies that are right now being considered in front of Congress. And so that's what I will do. So let's start with international tax and his seminal work on stateless income, but also let's remember some of his other papers here, including the adamantly titled Competitiveness Has Nothing to Do with It, and the amusingly titled Through a Latte Darkly, that looked at the tax planning of Starbucks. So the first thing I'll point out in terms of the current policy environment is that we've just witnessed a really abrupt change. Almost every country was moving very sharply towards territorial taxation, including the United States in some respects. But now countries representing almost 95% of world GDP have agreed to effectively a residence-based tax system, one that taxes the foreign income of their resident multinationals at an amount that is at least 15%. Countries are free to go above that. I think Ed would agree with the assessment of Larry Summers about this agreement, that it's arguably the most important international economic agreement of the 21st century. Ed felt very clearly that worldwide or residence-based systems were better than territorial, even if the United States had to do it alone. As he put it, we were left with the choice of the highly implausible, which is administering a territorial system that truly could police the source of income, and the manifestly imperfect, which was the residence-based system. He felt strongly that the latter was more defensible and that the early efforts by the OECD to make territoriality work were fundamentally prone to failure. As he put it, it was akin to holding back the sea with a broom. Source was just too difficult to enforce. Residence, on the other hand, was far more defensible, and simple common sense anti-inversion measures could help the United States defend its own tax base, even if we pursued this alone. Thus, I think he would have been mostly pleased with the administration's Green Book proposals in this space, even absent the international agreement. While companies would have complained of competitiveness concerns, which is all people talk about in DC, he would have been more than happy to push back, as he always has, against these arguments. For example, when the United States had a 35% corporate tax rate and a purportedly worldwide system of taxation, companies often complained that they were at a competitive disadvantage. And those complaints brought about real policy changes. First, the repatriation holiday in 2004, that despite the hopeful title of the legislation had no effect whatsoever on investment or job creation. And then the Tax Act of 2017, whereby the United States moved purportedly to a territorial system. But both before and after 2017, as Ed would describe it, competitiveness concerns were, as he put it, fact-free. Pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we lived under what Kleinbard referred to as an ersatz territorial system. I myself somewhat prefer Jason Furman's term, which is stupid territorial system, but they mean roughly the same thing. US companies could achieve the equivalent of territoriality, but there would be inefficiencies along the way, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to get the cash to their shareholders. Ed pointed out that US multinationals were able to achieve tax rents by using stateless income planning to achieve lower effective tax rates than their peers, while still earning high before tax rates of return abroad. US regulations facilitated this, including the check the box regulation of the late 1990s that Roseanne's work pointed to. Lawmakers were presumably less than persuaded by the Kleinbard view, so they moved to a territorial system as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, all in the name of competitiveness. Whether this actually made US companies more competitive was impossible to determine a priori, since for some, the tax burden on foreign income actually increased due to this new hybrid territoriality because of the inclusion of the GILTI minimum tax, which, as has been pointed out today, recognized that stateless income was a problem. In the end, though, there were still large advantages for US multinational companies due to their tax planning. As Kleinbard looked at the matter at the time, the minimum tax was effectively, as he put it, a maximum tax. Companies could easily combine sources of income from low and high tax countries, acting like a master distiller, that metaphor we've heard already today, to hit the GILTI rate. So I think he would have been quite happy with the move to a per country system. But both before and after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the evidence supported Kleinbard's view that competitiveness wasn't really what this was about. The key company concern was to have low effective tax burdens, and indeed they achieved that objective. Recent analysis shows that US multinationals are facing an effective tax rate of about 8% as a group. This is about 10 percentage points lower than their top 10 trading partners, and individual company analysis shows similar things. So in the end, Ed preferred the worldwide consolidation solution, taking the manifestly imperfect over the highly implausible. So let's ask, what would he think of the current state of affairs? First, we've made a large move towards the residence-based system, both in the US proposals and frankly, the entire world. So I think he would be happy with that. I would hope he would have been happy with this evolution of the OECD efforts from holding back the sea with the broom all the way toward a system of true coordinated minimum taxation that was residence-based. He would no doubt observe that profit shifting incentives are smaller, but they nonetheless remain. He would no doubt have very little patience with the business community's concern that these changes are still going to render US companies less competitive. Not only was there policy room in the first place, but the rest of the world has raised the floor from 0 to 15%, So any reasonably proposed tax rates that the United States might suggest, such as 21 or 28, will still be more competitive than they were before this floor was raised. So there's no need for the United States to match the lowest common denominator country, and I wish you were around to say that. Indeed, I believe he would applaud the fact that the last remaining argument against taxing mobile capital has been completely eviscerated by this international agreement. So I cannot tell you how much we miss his commentary. Ed had a rare credibility, right? He inhabited all of the worlds, the academic world, the policy world, the practitioner world, and he was not hesitant to call bad arguments, but to do it in a way that wasn't strident or mean, but that showed humor and wit. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and of course, at times, that's a really good thing. So on international tax, I think he'd be equal parts cheered and frustrated, actually, in some ways, with the present moment. I think he'd be cheered by the enormous progress we've made to tackle really vexing long-term problems, but I think he'd also be frustrated by some of the arguments that are made in opposition that have really watered down some of these proposals. And I think he'd be frustrated by the nature of the US political system itself, which has brought about all sorts of compromises here. And like myself, I think he'd also be kind of nervous about whether it'll really get done. I mean, there was supposed to be a vote on this today. It's unclear that will happen, but so there's some outstanding concern. Beyond international tax, of course, Ed was interested in larger questions of fiscal policy. And so based on his books, we can also sort of evaluate the present policy moment. I think we've heard really nice overviews of the books, and they are quite relevant to things that are under consideration today. So the pandemic has entailed an enormous fiscal response, and we've seen both the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. Not every element of these legislative efforts was really well targeted in Ed's view, I would suspect. But I do think that there were many elements in there that he would have found big steps forward towards the aims that he highlights in his books. So at the core of these two books are two important insights. First, that tax progressivity might be highly desirable, but that spending was ultimately more important if you wanted to address the most urgent needs of society. Second, and related, that existential luck plays an enormous role in our economic fortunes, and the government has an essential role in countering the whims of existential luck through social insurance. So how do we evaluate the Build Back Better package, the one that's before Congress as we speak, in Edward's eyes? He certainly would have appreciated the intended investments in social insurance that he argued for so passionately in his What's Luck Got to Do with It book. The package elements that would provide free preschool, expanded and a fully refundable child tax credit, home care for the elderly and disabled, expanded premium tax credits for health insurance, Medicaid expansion, Pell Grant expansion, nutrition assistance, housing, and the emphasis on equity. All of these are really entirely consistent with what he argued so forcefully for. And I suspect he would wholeheartedly support those types of proposals. So while he would have valued that emphasis on spending and raising up those at the bottom of the income distribution, I suspect he would have been a little impatient with some elements that have restricted our fiscal options. As one example, I suspect that Kleinbard would have viewed the pledge to not raise taxes on those under 400,000 with great skepticism. In fact, he argued forcefully in his first book that we are better than this, that government action to address essential priorities is needed, and the government is worth paying for everyone, even for those that are not at the very, very top end of the income distribution. Indeed, if he were here, he would likely point out that providing true social insurance simply requires a large tax base, and that countries that have been most successful doing so have often relied on tax bases that by themselves are not particularly progressive. Still, Kleinbard would point out, if the spending was done progressively, the overall effect is still progressive. So I can easily imagine having this conversation with Ed. And of course, I would point out that there are political constraints. Like many scholars, Ed would sometimes rue that we lived in the world as it is, where political elections can be won or lost based on these kinds of pledges. He might even reluctantly see the logic behind the pledge. but that doesn't mean he'd be happy about it. And I think that's fair. So finally, let me just say a few words about the dual bite, since Ed would be very unhappy if I ignored it. He would constantly help me with, information about this. And even beyond the grave now, Suzanne has done the same, so that I am constantly reminded of the virtues of the dual bite. This is a grand reform, if there ever was one. It is intricate and detailed, far more specced out than many grand reforms. And Ed was impatient with those that suggested grand reforms without also thinking through all of the details and really truly imagining how it would work, how it would be legislated, how the regulations that would implement it would be formed. Yeah, let me tell you, even more than I could have imagined, these kinds of grand reforms are very difficult. It's even difficult to do sensible incremental reforms that start from the current starting point, much less kind of imagining a new starting point and doing the kinds of things that would be required to put the dual bite in place. For someone who'd already spent time in private practice and already spent time at the Joint Committee, Ed had really a profound sense of idealism if he could really imagine this sort of wholesale reform that the dual bite would entail happening. It has been a long time since 1986, but in that year, bipartisan consensus could pass a grand reform. And the vote, by the way, was 97-3 in the Senate. So take a moment to just think about how different that is from where we are now. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed without a single Democratic vote. If Build Back Better passes, which I hope it does, it will not achieve a single Republican vote, I predict. In this partisan climate, I think it's much harder to do the kinds of really fundamental, deep reforms that the dual bite represents. That doesn't mean that one can't tackle some of the issues that the dual bite tackles. They do need to be tackled. A few of them are the organizational form distortion. And I thought Rich Rubin spoke about why that one is hard, because 199A is like a sacred cow now. We've had it for a few years. So that's one thing that's quite difficult. The debt equity distortion, Jason Furman had a nice proposal to basically remove interest deductions and have full expensing. And he says every economist he tells about it loves it. Every business person hates it. Right, so that kind of grand proposal will also be hard to do. Distinguishing normal from excess returns in the tax system is a difficult thing to do, and it's difficult to sort of sell people on the efficiency distinctions between those. Taxing unrealized gains, as we've seen, is really vexing, right? And that's something that these grand reforms can sometimes achieve, but the mark to market, 24 hours of fame, I think does show us how very, very difficult this is. I think I would obviously be disappointed we did not enact the dual bite reform, but the political moment is likely to stand in the way of those grand reforms, and that's simply too bad. In the end, there is quite a role for luck in defining our political moments, and what is possible often depends on circumstances that are really outside of our control. So let me just end with the quote that he put at the beginning of his last work, which is a quote from Stendhal. And I think it's actually very charming and poignant that this quote is at the beginning of his final book. The quote is, "Waiting for God to reveal himself, I believe his prime minister Chance governs this sad world just as well." So Chance unfortunately took Ed from us too early, but let's hope that it will be with the rest of us in the time ahead as we continue to build on his work. Turn it over to Chye-Ching.
Thanks so much, Kim. It was terrific getting to hear those comments, and I've so appreciated the entire conference, and I'm so grateful to be able to share some thoughts about Ed and his scholarship in this policy moment. Zooming back a few policy moments now, I first arrived in DC to be a pretty junior tax policy analyst at the Centre on Budget, a think tank. By that time, Ed had held a number of potentially quite intimidating titles. I was pretty new to DC, but I still knew that Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation was a pretty fancy role. And as a former corporate lawyer, I definitely knew that Cleary Gottlieb partner was very fancy. But I wasn't introduced to Ed by anyone with an impressive title or deep connections. I was introduced by one of my team's junior RAs. At that time, a repatriation tax holiday was a big policy deal, and Ed, along with Pat Dreesen at Joint Committee on Taxation, had written a piece explaining the Joint Committee's methodology for estimating the impact of a repatriation tax holiday. And it was a really a somewhat novel type of product for JCT, and it really went through very carefully some of the considerations that went into that revenue estimate. So that piece, it was incredibly helpful for us engaging with and having to understand and explain to staff, lawmakers, and the media the different factors that were driving the cost estimate and what that might mean for different variations of the proposal, and what the policy implications were. And as part of that work, this RA, sort of 6 months out of undergraduate school, had emailed Ed Gould with a series of questions about this paper, and for accuracy checks on how he was writing it up. And that led to some of this copious email correspondence that RA probably had an Ed folder too, and many phone calls to sort of sort out these technical questions about how to think about estimating different variants of a repatriation tax proposal. Now, unfortunately, as I've seen more often in DC, not all folks who are very important formers would spend hours with someone who is an RA and therefore not important by some very silly superficial standards. But as everybody on this call would know, Ed would. And it was simply out of a desire to make sure that these concepts were understood and that people who were wanting to get things right did so, and added to the net understanding of people who were actually making policy based on that information. And as that RA passed that introduction over to me over the next many years, I learned that Ed was just as generous with that knowledge and teaching skill with me and basically anyone else, whether they were a student, an intern, or a senator, who just wanted to understand something really well. And as we've heard this afternoon, he kept expanding his own scholarship and understanding. And as he explored a somewhat broader range of topics in his books, his desire to get things right was always just as evident. We were lucky to be able to pay back just a small amount of the time that he spent explaining things to us by helping him cite check or having a second eye over graphs in his book, because he really wanted to make sure he was doing things in the most robust way possible. And that's how I was introduced to Ed, and it very much connects with a lot of what I've been thinking about, missing his input on this current policy moment. We've talked about, over the course of this conference, his contributions on big policy ideas, on overall distributional issues and moral philosophy, and the shape of the fiscal system and the economy that he tackled in his books, in international tax, big reform, and in the specific tax treatment of particular arrangements and transactions. And from his work there, we have a really good sense of what he might say there. But as Kim mentioned, in the crush of lawmaking, many of us also relied upon and really now miss his other types of contributions, the ones that were really, really deep in the weeds on methodology matters, on how to think about analyzing a particular proposal or analysis or working paper or claim or whatever else it was in front of us, whether it was a line in an op-ed or a 30-page paid study that was claiming some new thing. Maybe it had the competitiveness label slapped on the top of it. And he's contributed so much across his work on thinking through those elements of analysis of policy that are a fixture of these tax law and policy debates and have been so important in the round we're in right now. How distribution tables are created and what the relationship is of JCT distribution tables in an attempt to measure welfare, how tax expenditures are measured and estimated, how to think about estimating the revenue impacts of certain items and what that means or doesn't mean. And he knew very well that these methodology decisions and the way that we talk about them can be used to illuminate or obscure the impacts of tax policy. And sometimes he'd write or speak about those in the case of that JCT piece on the repatriation tax holiday. But often it would just be that spending hours emailing with an RA or talking through an early career analyst or reporter who was trying to make sense of a table or analysis and just needed someone with Ed's perception and ability to explain and be able to blow through all of the chaff to the core of an issue as things were moving really fast. And this is just the sort of moment that we're in right now. And I miss the ability to send Ed that other new study on how many millions of jobs or some tax policy change will cost, or ask him how he thinks about the methodological approach behind some important new empirical paper. Those of us still doing this can get to sort of try and rely on and channel his past work, but it's a pretty big gap to fill. So, it is absolutely good to, as this panel is titled, start with what would Ed say, what would he think on the methodology questions as well as the big policy issues. The other thing that I often also find myself thinking about in policy debates now is yet another vein of Ed's writing, which encourage us to think about how processes and institutions, how and when things are measured and scored, how and when things get put into law or come out of it, impact on or distort, and sometimes in his view, tax policy outcomes. I'm thinking about his writing on tax expenditures and the process, again, thinking about sort of how scoring and when that comes about, and whether we should be looking at both revenue and distribution, and how we should be doing that, those sorts of contributions. And, again, stepping away from just Build Back Better to sort of a bigger political moment, this is one where many of us across many different policy issue areas have been asked to think about strengthening processes and institutions and structures, not just in tax policy, but in democratic lawmaking writ large. And there was a through line of that in Ed's writing. He was encouraging us to try and confront and improve that too, and had some policy proposals for doing that in specific tax process areas. So I started with just a brief story about being introduced to Ed and his work in the earliest part of my tax policy career. I'd like to end by just sharing that over the last 2 years, as my colleagues and I have worked to develop the Tax Law Center at NYU Law, I've just had the opportunity to have so many conversations with people, including many of you on this Zoom, about what this new center should do to try to work in the public interest to improve tax policy. And I have lost count of the number of times people have praised Ed and his work as an exemplar of what we should be looking to as we think about our work. I've sorely missed just being able to ask him what he thinks, but I've benefited from those of you who knew him well, knew his perspective well, being able to feed some of that in because of your knowledge about his views on the public interest and what we can do to shape that. So again, I'd like to end by a sort of underscoring that this perfect title of the session, What Would Ed Think, isn't a bad starting point at all when faced with all of these hardest puzzles in tax policy, in tax methodology of analysis, and the question of the processes and institutions about how it should be made. Again, I'm so glad to be here and to be able to hear and share appreciations of his lasting contributions.
Thank you so much. That was Kim and Chye-Ching, just wonderful. I think we definitely have some time for questions or comments, and please use the raise your hand, and I'm glad to call on people. But I'm gonna take the prerogative as moderator to start by sharing with you an image that was important to add. I hope you're seeing this now. This was an image, the image that he kept on the cover of the workbook that he used for the last book. What's got luck got to do with it? That he's desperate to want to have this for the cover of the book when the publisher declined. But I think this animates, how he organized his thinking about the world and that informed his worldview, and also his deep background as a medievalist from his early days as Brown, and his lingering insistence that we vacation in places where he could visit Romanesque architecture. So I will leave this there as for folks to think about, just as a final image to view. And unless you're all like completely worn down, I can't believe that nobody has anything else to say. I think you guys have just blown the cover off the back of the conference. Thank you. All right, then I think we're going to have, I do see a hand.
Actually, all I was going to say is let's go to the reception.
I was going to say, so if I think it's been a long day, and thanks everybody for being on this. Greg, were there some closing comments that we?
Yes, I do need, it won't be as long as an Oscar speech because I don't have Meryl Streep to thank, although I can tell you that Meryl Streep and Ed Kleinbard owned houses in the same towns in Connecticut and in Los Angeles. Their Los Angeles homes were both in Pasadena, and I honestly don't know the name. I've forgotten the name of the Connecticut town. So there's the obligatory Meryl Streep reference for the thank yous. But I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Ed would have been very happy to see all of you and very happy to have the turnout, and to, I think he is missing having the chance to engage with all of us. And I'd like to thank the speakers for their presentations, the organizing committee for its work in putting the panels together and organizing the conference. And I'd like to thank my Dean, Andrew Guzman, and apologize for making him lip sync things, from which I learned my hearing is declining, but my lip reading skills are not ascending. And I would especially like to thank Mira Dalpe, Angela Hoof, and the entire academic operations staff for shifting midstream from planning for a live conference to a Zoom conference, and for doing such a wonderful job of pulling this together. And last and most importantly, I want to thank Suzanne for all of her work in organizing this. She's been the primary force behind the conference. It simply would not have happened without her. And I think it's been extraordinary what she's done and what she came up with. So the Zoom reception will begin in a few minutes, and please stay logged on. Mira's team is going to do a head count in order to determine if we need to break out into breakout rooms, or and if so, how many. So we're sort of taking a break, but leave your Zoom connection on if you would like to join the Zoom reception.